The seed offering that saved a family. Introduction. There are moments in life when everything seems to fall apart at once. The bills pile up. The phone stops ringing with good news. Friends become distant. Hope begins to dry up like water under the scorching sun. In moments like that, many people ask the same question. God, where are you? This is the story of a family that stood at the edge of total destruction, and how one impossible act of faith changed everything. This is not just a story about money. It is a story about sacrifice. It is a story about obedience. It is a story about faith in the middle of pain. And above all, it is a story about how one seed offering saved an entire family. Chapter 1. The family everyone envied. In the quiet town of Riverdale Heights lived a man named Daniel Okoro. Daniel was known as one of the hardest working men in the city. He worked as a senior manager at a construction company and earned enough to give his family a comfortable life. His wife, Grace, was gentle, wise, and deeply prayerful. She ran a small catering business from home and was loved by nearly everyone who knew her. Together, they had 3 children. Michael, the intelligent first son who dreamed of becoming a doctor. Sarah, the cheerful daughter who loved singing in church. And little Joshua, only 7 years old, whose laughter could brighten the darkest room. From the outside, their life looked perfect. They owned a beautiful home. They drove to cars. Their children attended good schools. They were active members of their church. People often said, Daniel and Grace are blessed. But nobody knew the storm that was approaching. Chapter 2. The beginning of trouble. One rainy Monday morning, Daniel was called unexpectedly into the office of his company director. The moment he walked in, something felt wrong. The director avoided eye contact. Daniel, the director, sighed heavily. The company is downsizing. We've lost several major contracts. I'm sorry, but today will be your last day. Daniel froze. He thought he had heard wrongly. Sir, after 15 years? The director lowered his head. It's not personal. Not personal. Those 2 words echoed in Daniel's mind like thunder. Within minutes, everything changed. His office keys were collected. His access card was disabled. His salary stopped. His benefits disappeared. Daniel walked out of the building under heavy rain, carrying only a cardboard box. And for the first time in many years, he felt afraid. Chapter 3. Hiding the truth. When Daniel got home, Grace immediately noticed something was wrong. You're home early, she said softly. Daniel forced a smile. Just tired. But Grace knew her husband too well. Later that night, after the children slept, Daniel finally broke down. I lost my job. Grace stared at him silently. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then she reached for his hand. We'll get through this. Daniel shook his head. You don't understand. We still owe the bank for this house. Michael's school fees are due next month. The car loan hasn't been completed. We barely have savings. Grace remained calm. God will help us. But Daniel could not sleep that night. He stared at the ceiling until morning. Fear had entered the house. Chapter 4. Doors closing everywhere. At first, Daniel believed he would quickly find another job. After all, he was experienced. He had qualifications. He had connections. But weeks turned into months. Every interview ended in disappointment. "We'll get back to you." Unfortunately, they never did. One company hired someone younger, another chose someone cheaper, another postponed recruitment entirely. Slowly, their savings vanished. The electricity bill became overdue. The internet was disconnected. The second car was sold. Grace tried expanding her catering business, but customers reduced. Then came the biggest blow. Michael's school sent a letter. Outstanding fees must be paid immediately, or the student will be suspended. Daniel felt humiliated. One evening, he sat alone in darkness after the electricity was disconnected. He whispered, "God, why is this happening to us?" Chapter 5: The Unexpected Diagnosis. As if financial hardship wasn't enough, tragedy struck again. One afternoon, little Joshua collapsed while playing football outside. Grace screamed. Daniel rushed him to the hospital. After several tests, the doctor called them into his office. The doctor's expression was serious. "Your son has a heart condition." Grace nearly fainted. Daniel's hands trembled. "The surgery he needs is expensive," the doctor continued carefully. "Without treatment, his condition could worsen." "How much?" Daniel whispered. The doctor mentioned an amount far beyond what they could afford. Daniel felt the room spinning. How could this be happening? First his job, then debt, now his son's life. On the drive home, nobody spoke. Joshua sat quietly in the back seat. At one point he asked innocently, "Daddy, am I going to die?" Daniel nearly broke. Chapter 6: The Last Hope. The following Sunday, despite everything, Grace insisted they attend church. Daniel didn't want to go. He felt angry. He felt ashamed. He felt abandoned by God. But Grace persuaded him. That Sunday, the guest preacher delivered a message titled, "When Your Last Seed Becomes Your Miracle." Daniel listened reluctantly. The preacher spoke about faith. He spoke about sacrifice. He spoke about trusting God when circumstances make no sense. Then the preacher said something that pierced Daniel's heart. Sometimes your miracle is hidden inside the seed you are afraid to release. Daniel looked away. The preacher continued. The widow of Zarephath gave her last meal to the prophet, and heaven sustained her family during famine. Grace quietly held Daniel's hand. Then came the moment nobody expected. The preacher announced a special seed offering for a missionary hospital project. People slowly walked forward. Daniel remained seated. He barely had money for transportation home. But suddenly, Grace leaned close and whispered, "Daniel, I believe we should sow." Daniel stared at her in disbelief. "So what?" Grace swallowed hard. "The money we've been hiding." Daniel's eyes widened. The hidden envelope, their emergency savings, the only money left for food, the only money standing between them and total collapse. "You can't be serious," Daniel whispered. But Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I know it sounds crazy, but I feel strongly in my spirit." Daniel became angry. "Our son needs surgery? I know. We're drowning already? I know. And you want to give away our last money?" Grace looked at him with trembling faith. "Yes." Chapter 7: The Battle Inside Daniel. After church, Daniel refused to speak. He drove home in silence. That night, he sat alone holding the envelope. Inside was everything they had left. It wasn't enough to solve their problems, but it was enough to survive a few more weeks. Daniel's mind battled itself. What if this is foolish? What if God does nothing? What if Joshua dies because of this decision? But another voice whispered quietly inside him. What if obedience opens the door? Around midnight, Grace joined him. She said softly, "I'm not forcing you, but I believe God is asking us to trust Him completely." Daniel looked exhausted. "I'm afraid." Grace nodded. "So am I." Then she said something Daniel would never forget. Faith is not believing when things are easy. Faith is obeying when you are terrified. Daniel stared at the envelope for a long time. Then slowly, he stood up. Chapter 8. The Seed Offering. The next morning, Daniel and Grace returned to church before sunrise. The sanctuary was almost empty. Daniel held the envelope tightly. His hands were shaking. At the altar, he knelt. Tears rolled down his face. "God, this is all we have." He paused. "Our son is sick. We have debt everywhere. I don't understand what you are doing, but today we choose to trust you." Grace knelt beside him. Together, they placed the envelope on the altar. It felt like burying their final hope. As they walked out of the church, Daniel felt strangely lighter. Not because their problems disappeared. Nothing had changed physically. The bills still existed. Joshua was still sick. They were still broke. But something inside them shifted. They had surrendered everything. Chapter 9. The Eviction Notice. 3 days later, the bank sent a final warning. If payment was not made within 14 days, foreclosure proceedings would begin. Grace read the letter silently. Daniel sank into a chair. "We may lose the house." The children overheard the conversation. That night, Sarah cried herself to sleep. Michael became unusually quiet. Even little Joshua asked, "Will we become homeless?" Daniel hugged his son tightly. Inside, however, he felt crushed. Had they made a terrible mistake? Chapter 10. A strange phone call. The next morning, Daniel received a call from an unknown number. "Hello, is this Mr. Daniel Okoro?" "Yes, my name is Victor Mendez. We met years ago at a leadership conference in Canada." Daniel struggled to remember. Victor continued, "I recently heard your former company shut down operations. Are you currently available for consulting work?" Daniel sat upright. Yes, I am." Victor explained that his international construction firm needed someone experienced to oversee a large emergency project. "It's temporary for now," Victor said, "but the pay is excellent." Daniel's heart pounded. They scheduled a meeting immediately. For the first time in months, hope flickered. Chapter 11. The Miracle Delayed. Daniel attended the meeting dressed in his best suit. Victor welcomed him warmly. Everything seemed perfect. But just before finalizing the agreement, Victor received an urgent call. After several tense minutes, Victor returned looking troubled. "I'm sorry, Daniel. The project has been suspended unexpectedly." Daniel felt his heart sink. Again, another closed door. He forced a smile. "It's okay." But when he reached the parking lot, he broke down in tears. He punched the steering wheel repeatedly. God, why? He had obeyed. He had sacrificed. And still nothing changed. Or so he thought. Chapter 12. Grace refuses to give up. When Daniel got home, Grace listened quietly. Then she said, "Maybe the miracle is still coming." Daniel laughed bitterly. "Coming? We are sinking." Grace remained calm. "Daniel, do you remember Peter? Jesus told him to cast the net again after a night of failure. The miracle came after obedience." Daniel rubbed his face tiredly. "I don't know how much more I can take." Grace held his hand. "Then let me believe for both of us." Chapter 13. The Child's Prayer. That evening, Joshua walked into the living room carrying his small Bible. "Mommy," he said softly, "can we pray?" Grace smiled sadly. "Of course." The entire family joined hands. Joshua prayed innocently. "Dear Jesus, please heal me. Please help Daddy get a job. And please don't let us lose our house. Amen." When he finished, silence filled the room. Then Joshua added, "And thank you because I know you already answered." Daniel suddenly began to cry. The faith of a child pierced his broken spirit. Chapter 14. The Midnight Visitor. A week later, during heavy rain, someone knocked at their door around midnight. Daniel opened it cautiously. Standing outside was an elderly woman completely soaked. "Please," she whispered weakly, "my car broke down nearby. May I use your phone?" Grace immediately welcomed her inside. They offered her dry clothes and warm tea. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Evelyn Hart. While waiting for assistance, she noticed family photos on the wall. "You have a beautiful family," she smiled. Grace thanked her. Then unexpectedly, Joshua fainted again. Panic filled the house. Mrs. Hart watched as Daniel and Grace struggled. After Joshua recovered, Mrs. Hart quietly asked, "What's wrong with the boy?" Daniel explained everything. The sickness, the unemployment, the debt, the possible eviction. Mrs. Hart listened carefully. Before leaving, she held Grace's hand. "You showed kindness to a stranger while carrying your own pain. I will never forget this night." Daniel thought nothing of it, but heaven was already moving. Chapter 15. The Hidden Connection. 2 days later, Daniel received another unexpected call. "Mr. Okoro?" "Yes, this is the Office of Hart Foundation International. Mrs. Evelyn Hart requested a meeting with you." Immediately, Daniel froze. The elderly woman. At the meeting, Daniel discovered something shocking. Mrs. Hart was not an ordinary woman. She was the founder of one of the largest humanitarian foundations in the country. She smiled warmly when Daniel entered. "You and your wife helped me when you had nothing. Most people would have turned me away." Daniel remained speechless. Mrs. Hart continued, "I investigated your background after that night. Your former employers spoke highly of your integrity." Then she said the words Daniel would never forget. "I believe God sent me to your house." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. Mrs. Hart handed him a document. "We are launching a nationwide hospital construction initiative. I want you to lead the entire project." Daniel nearly stopped breathing. The salary was beyond anything he had previously earned. But the miracle didn't end there. Mrs. Hart added, "The foundation will also cover your son's surgery completely." Daniel broke down crying openly. Months of pain exploded in tears. God had not forgotten them. Chapter 16. The Surgery. Within weeks, Joshua was admitted into one of the best hospitals. The surgery date arrived. Grace spent the entire night praying. Daniel paced endlessly in the waiting room. Hours felt like years. Finally, the surgeon emerged. The entire family stood instantly. The doctor smiled. The surgery was successful. Grace collapsed into tears of gratitude. Daniel lifted his hands toward heaven. "Thank you, Lord." Little Joshua survived. The family that once stood on the edge of destruction was now witnessing miracle after miracle. Chapter 17. Restoration begins. Over the next year, everything changed. Daniel excelled in his new role. His leadership transformed the hospital project. The family paid off their debts. The foreclosure was cancelled. Michael returned to school. Sarah recorded her first gospel song. Joshua regained his health completely. But perhaps the greatest transformation happened inside Daniel. He became a different man. Before the crisis, he trusted mainly in salary, savings, and stability. Now he understood dependence on God. Chapter 18. The Testimony. One Sunday, the church invited Daniel and Grace to share their testimony. The sanctuary was filled. Many people already knew pieces of their story, but few knew the full truth. Daniel stood before the congregation holding the same empty envelope they once used for the seed offering. "This envelope once carried our last money," he said. Silence filled the church. "We were desperate. We were afraid. Our son was dying. We were losing everything." Grace continued, "But we discovered something powerful. Obedience often comes before understanding." Daniel nodded. "When we gave that seed, nothing changed immediately. In fact, things became worse." The congregation listened attentively, but God was working behind the scenes. Daniel's voice trembled. "Our seed offering did not buy a miracle. It revealed our trust in God." Many people began crying, and that day, countless lives were encouraged. Chapter 19. The Stranger at the Back. After the service, a young man approached Daniel. "My name is Samuel," he said quietly. Tears filled his eyes. "I was planning to end my life this week because of debt and hopelessness. But your story gave me hope." Daniel embraced him tightly. "You are not alone." That moment reminded Daniel why pain sometimes becomes a testimony. God was now using their suffering to rescue others. Chapter 20. The Real Miracle. Years later, Daniel sat on the porch watching Joshua play football again. Grace joined him. "Do you remember the night we gave the seed offering?" She smiled. Daniel laughed softly. "How could I forget?" Grace leaned against him. "We thought we were losing everything." Daniel nodded slowly. "But maybe God was removing the things we depended on, so we could depend fully on Him." They sat silently watching the sunset. Then Joshua ran toward them laughing. Healthy, alive, strong. And in that moment, Daniel realized something profound. The greatest miracle was not the money, not the new job, not even the healing. The greatest miracle was that their faith survived the storm. Extended reflection. Sometimes life pushes people into impossible situations. Sometimes prayers seem unanswered. Sometimes heaven feels silent. Sometimes obedience feels risky. But this story reminds us that God often works behind the scenes long before we see visible results. Faith is not pretending problems do not exist. Faith is trusting God despite the problems. The seed offering Daniel and Grace gave was not magical. It was symbolic. It represented surrender, trust, obedience, dependence on God. And often, breakthrough begins when people stop holding tightly to fear. Maybe someone listening to this story today feels hopeless. Maybe your situation looks impossible. Maybe your family is struggling. Maybe you feel forgotten. But remember this: darkness never lasts forever. Sometimes your greatest testimony is being prepared in the middle of your greatest trial. Bonus scene: 5 years later. 5 years later, Daniel stood before the grand opening of a new children's hospital built under the Heart Foundation initiative. Reporters filled the area. Government officials attended. Families celebrated. A large sign at the entrance read, "Joshua Children's Heart Center." Grace wiped tears from her eyes. Mrs. Hart smiled warmly. "You named it after your son." Daniel nodded. Because this place represents hope, hundreds of children would now receive life-saving treatment regardless of financial status. The same family that once could not afford surgery was now helping save countless lives. During the opening ceremony, Daniel addressed the crowd. "There was a time when my family nearly lost everything," he began. The audience listened carefully, but pain taught us compassion, struggle taught us faith, and one act of obedience changed our future forever. Applause filled the air. Joshua, now healthy and strong, stood beside his father proudly. And somewhere deep inside, Daniel remembered the empty envelope. The envelope that once carried their last seed. The seed offering that saved a family. If this story touched your heart, remember, never give up during difficult seasons. Your current situation is not the end of your story. Sometimes miracles begin in the places where hope seems lost. Faith does not always make sense in the moment, but often, years later, you look back and realize that God was guiding every step. And sometimes, the smallest seed becomes the beginning of the greatest harvest.